Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Tom, and today we are going to be continuing our life cycles chats. So, today we are going to talk about the life cycles of mammals and birds. And this is a really cool one. There's lots of cool stuff that we can talk about today. We have some cool animals to show you, and I'm really excited to be sharing all this. I hope you're all having a good day so far, and let's jump into it. So, we are going to start with mammals, which is a really cool group. Um, and that's because there's a lot of diversity in mammals. So mammals can range from anything from whales and dolphins to some animals or some pets that we have, like our cats and dogs, to things like bats that are flying. And then we have, of course, a lot of mammals that are found on land, such as cheetahs and elephants and lots of other animals. We also have monkeys, right, that are found in the trees. So we can have animals that range from our oceans to swinging in the trees, to flying in the air, to running and walking on land, right? So there's lots of diversity. It's really cool. And so that's why we're going to cover the life cycles of mammals. But before we do that, because there is so much diversity, I figured it would be useful to just talk about a couple of the characteristics that are unique to mammals that we can help use to classify or characterize mammals. So there's two that really come to mind when thinking about things that we want to talk about when thinking about mammals. And the first is their ability to produce milk for their young. So that is really important, especially for the babies or the infants that are born, is for the mothers to be able to provide milk through what are called mammary glands. And that's just a really nutritious diet for those really young babies to be able to feed on when they're still really young, so that they can start to develop before they really have to go out on their own and start becoming independent. So that's a nice food source that's available to them to help them grow nice and strong before they have to go out on their own. And then the second one that we always think about, right, is the presence of fur or hair. So this is found in all mammals to a certain degree, at least during some portion of their lifespan. So kind of cool to think about, but even some dolphins and whales have hairs, which you wouldn't really think about, right? But they're still mammals. So some cool dolphins in the Amazon actually have some hairs near their nose or their snout, which are actually believed to be sensory, that can help them find food in the Amazon, which is really cool to think about. Um, and there's lots of different roles that hairs play that are really important to mammals. So one that I was just talking about is sensory, right? So dolphins have it, but other animals that we commonly think about as mammals have them as well, like our cats, right? So cats use their whiskers, right, to kind of be aware of their surroundings. The most important probably is hair provides warmth, or what we call insulation for mammals. So this can really help them stay warm, especially when it's cold, and that's important as well. And then also hairs sometimes can be used as kind of a way to provide some threatening behaviors to predators, kind of maybe to warn them off. So if you've ever seen your cat or your dog get startled or scared, sometimes they'll raise up the hair on their backs, right? And that's just a way for mammals to kind of make themselves look larger and say like, hey, whoa, maybe you want to back away. So hairs are really important. And then there's a whole lot of other characteristics that a lot of mammals share that might not be unique just to mammals. So some cool ones are, the different types of teeth that they have. So kind of a cool example. Um, what I have here is a cheetah skull. So you can see the variation in teeth right away, ranging from like those canines that are useful for puncturing or tearing meat, and then some things like the molars, right, that are just more useful for chewing. So that's kind of a cool characteristic. Not all mammals have that, but most of them do, and it's a cool characteristic that's shared between them. And then there's other things like the fact that mammals are what we call endotherms, or what we will call warm-blooded, right, which means that they are able to produce their own body heat and, more importantly, maintain a stable body temperature. That's really important. And there's other things, but really the hair, the presence of hair at some portion of their lifespan, and for a lot of mammals during all of their life, and then the ability to produce milk. And we'll talk about the production of that milk a little bit more once we dive into the life cycles, which we're going to do now. So before we really start talking about the life cycles of mammals, I thought it'd be important to just kind of go over again what a life cycle is and why it's important. So a life cycle, right, is the series of developmental stages or changes that an animal goes through during its life until it reaches adulthood, right? So we're going to talk about the different stages for mammals, and really these stages are going to vary a little bit for pretty much all animals, and that's because animals want to have life cycles that help them meet their life history requirements or those basic needs of animals. Things such as growing and surviving and defending themselves and reproducing and having young of their own. So life cycles are going to vary, but that's so that they can meet those life history requirements to the best of their ability wherever they may be found, whatever habitat they're in. So the life cycle of mammals isn't too complex compared to some of the other ones that we'll talk about. In general, there's the three stages, which is the baby or the infant, the juvenile or the young, and then the adult. So the baby or the infant starts developing within the mother during what's called a gestation period, which is kind of a big term, but really it's just how long that baby is developing inside the mother until it is born. And so when that's happening, they're starting to develop already, that embryo is starting to develop and gaining some features so that it can be born and ready to start growing. And so once those babies are born, they can then start receiving parental care. And so that's when that milk really comes into use. So a lot of newborn infants or babies for mammals will remain with the mother for some period of time to feed off that milk. And that really, again, starts to help them develop and grow before they can go out on their own. And then a lot of other newborns will actually stay with the mother for some period, even after they're done feeding on that milk or nursing. And that's so that they can learn how to go out and find food on their own. They can learn how to defend themselves, become aware of their environment. And so they will do that with the mother or the parents for some period of time before they go out and become a juvenile or a young. So at that stage, individuals are old enough and big enough that they are then independent from the parents, and they will go out and they will start hunting on their own, finding food on their own. They have to defend themselves. They oftentimes have to find their own new territory because now they're independent from their parents, right? And at this stage, they start to develop their reproductive organs as well. So they need to start growing and developing towards being an old enough individual that they can then reproduce on their own. And at that stage, once they do that, they are considered an adult. So adults are old enough that they can reproduce on their own, and then they're going to start investing time in things such as finding a mate or finding another individual that they can pair with, having young of their own reproducing, taking care of that young, right? So we talked about the parents, the young or those newborns sticking around with the parents for that parental care. So parents now have to invest time in their young. And then, at that point, once they've reproduced on their own, that life cycle has restarted, right? So not too complex, right? What's kind of cool with mammals is that a lot of mammals will be born looking like the parents, but just in a way that they need to grow and develop further, right, before they reach that sexual maturity or that adult age. But with that being said, even though it's kind of relatively simple, there are some cool variations in the life cycles of mammals. And so mammals are kind of placed into one of three different groups, and we're going to go over those three different groups. So the first is what we call a placental mammal. So that one is the most simple. It's the most normal. It's kind of what we think about when we think about most mammals, with just being born live and then feeding off of the milk of that mother. So I have one here today that I'm going to show you. Give me 1 second while I gear up. So I'm going to take out a mammal. And for that reason, we do have to put on some protective equipment because we do not want to pass anything to them and we want to keep them healthy and safe. So our first mammal that we have for you is not found here in Georgia. It's actually found in Africa, and it is a pygmy hedgehog. So this is green bean. Green bean is a African pygmy hedgehog. This is what we would refer to as a placental mammal, meaning that they will give birth to live young that are ready to then start feeding off that milk with the mother. So going through the life cycle kind of a pygmy hedgehog, they do have about a 1 month period where they start developing in the mother first before they are even born. And then they will stay with the mother for about 2 months in the nest where they will, feed off of that milk. And then what's kind of cool too is that, and then I was talking about the parental care, right? So then the young or the babies will actually go around and travel with the mother for a couple weeks up to maybe a month to kind of learn how to move around, find food, get aware of their environment. And this is actually really important for hedgehogs because they travel long distances to find their food. So it is not uncommon for African pygmy hedgehogs to travel up to or further than a mile in a night just to find food, which is really far if you think about it. I don't even like going out to drive a mile in my car at night to find food. I just like to be at home, right? So the fact that they can travel over a mile just to find food each night, especially with these little legs, is very impressive. So learning from their mother is probably really important, right? What you can see too is they have kind of that long nose. So that's one of their best senses is their smell that they will use to find their food. So they're primarily insectivores, so they'll try to find insects to feed off of. But they'll also eat other things. So they're omnivores, meaning they'll eat plant material as well. And they eat a lot. So that traveling is important. But again, so is that parental care. So they will stay with their mother for about a month to learn about that. And then, they will become independent and go off on their own and start to find their food. And then they'll become sexually mature at just about a couple months, maybe definitely less than a year until they're able to reproduce on their own. And that's because, speaking of the life cycle, they have a relatively short lifespan. That's only about 3 to 5 years in the wild. So if you think about smaller individuals, they need to grow up older faster so that they can complete their life cycle, considering they have kind of a shorter lifespan. So we have a question here about green bean and hedgehogs that says, do hedgehogs have spikes as babies? It's a great question. So talking about parental care and why it might be important for hedgehogs to remain with their parents is because they actually don't have those spines as babies. So one of the really important things that's important for them to be staying with the mother is so that they can have that milk and be developing spines before they leave and become independent on their own, because that's really important for their defense, right? So one thing that they'll do is they'll curl up into a ball, and then all of these spines that you can see, which are pokey and sharp, will help protect them. So when they're young, when they're just in that baby or infant stage, it's nice to be with the mother for protection and in that safe nest area. And so also speaking about mammals and the characteristics that are unique to mammals, those spines are actually hairs. So we were talking about hair or fur being unique to mammals, right? Those spines are actually specialized hairs that are formed with keratin, which is the same material that our hairs and our fingernails are made out of. So that's really cool too. And you can see that more towards the face, and let's see, green bean will show us his belly. They're softer in the belly, and they have more typical hairs. That's normal, and that's why it's really important for them to form up into a ball if they are feeling threatened, so that they can have those harder hairs exposed to protect them. So that's an example of our placental mammal, and that's green bean. So I'm gonna put green bean back now, but a really cool mammal, right? And then we're gonna talk about some of our other types of mammals and their life cycles. Okay, so another type of mammal that we have, I'm actually going to share a PowerPoint with you really quick. Oh, that's our hedgehog. So the next one is what we call marsupial. So marsupials are a bit more unique in their life cycle in that when they're first born, they're born really kind of underdeveloped or not ready to be exposed to the environment, even with the mother. So something kind of cool to think about is that African pygmy hedgehog I just showed you, green bean, only has a gestation period or is only raised in the mother for about a month before it is born. Kangaroos are actually only also raised internally or developing internally in the mother for a month before they are born. And so if you can think about an animal like this kangaroo that's much larger than that little hedgehog that I showed you, and yet they have the same developmental period in the mother, you can imagine when the kangaroo comes out, they're really small and they're not ready to be exposed to the environment yet. And so what's cool about marsupials, and that you can see with these pictures, is that the mothers have a pouch that those really, really small and weak animals, babies, can crawl into. So at just a month, these little tiny babies that are super small will actually crawl through the hair of the kangaroo and jump into the pouch, where then they can receive that milk. So they still have the milk that is provided to them from the mother, but that happens in that pouch. And they'll stay in that pouch to nurse on that milk for about 6 months until I'm actually gonna put green bean back down so I can take this mask off so you can hear me better. They'll stay in that pouch for about 6 months where they can develop there. And then even after that 6-month period, they'll also go through parental care. So during that 2-month period, roughly, of parental care, they will go out and they'll start exploring on their own. They'll start feeding on vegetation. So they're getting on more of their normal diet that they'll be on once they're an adult. But then they will still return back to the pouch during those 2 months for protection, for care. They can still feed on the milk during those 2 months, but again, at least they're starting to venture out on their own, feeding on vegetation. And then after that 2-month period of beginning that exploration and learning to find food on their own, they'll become independent. So kangaroos, they complete their life cycle, they'll become sexually mature. They can reproduce after about 1 to 3 years, depending on if they're a female or a male. And then they have a lifespan of about 7 years. But just super cool. I really wanted to point out that connection between how long a kangaroo baby is in development at that initial stage compared to the hedgehog, and that's why these pouches are really important. And so kangaroos aren't the only marsupials. There are also animals like possums that you may be more familiar with that also have a pouch and are considered marsupials and will raise their young there. But really cool. Okay. So moving on to our third kind of group of mammals is what we call a monotreme. So This is a platypus. They are very, very interesting animals. It is a mammal. You can kind of see they have a furry coat, especially in the young down there at the bottom. But they're very strange, if you ask me. So they kind of have a beaver-like tail. They have a bill that kind of looks like a bird's, but then they also have mammal-like skin and fur, right? But this is called a monotreme, and so their life cycle is again different. And theirs is super unique in that they have eggs that the young have to hatch from in order to begin their life cycle. So they're a mammal, right? But they actually lay eggs. So the eggs will actually start developing internally, kind of like the embryos of those other mammals will. And so they'll stay in internal for about 2 weeks, where they will receive nutrients to be able to start growing. But then they will actually be laid in the environment. So this platypus here um, will lay its eggs in kind of like in burrows of riverbanks in the sand. Um, and then after 10 days, the eggs will hatch. So during those 10 days, the mother is going to stay with the eggs. She's going to incubate the eggs. She's going to keep them warm to help them grow and develop. And then they're going to hatch. And then even after they hatch, again, the young or those babies are going to stay with the mother, and they're going to nurse. So they still get milk. So the big key distinguishing feature for these mammals is that they lay eggs, which is super strange, right? But really cool. And so really cool animals. They have a lifespan of about 11 to 17 years, so they kind of fall on the later edge of the extreme of the mammals that we've talked about so far. So they don't develop to be adults until a little bit older than some of those kangaroos or the African pygmy hedgehogs. So really cool animals. And that's our third category of mammals and how their life cycle differs a little bit. And then we can move on to our birds. So we're also going to talk about the life cycle of birds. Their life cycles have a couple more stages. Let me get out of this. They have a couple more stages in their life cycle compared to the mammals. And so there's some variation in the life cycle, but what it falls through is a couple different categories, and that's because the hatchlings go through a couple different phases. So in general, right, some characteristics to think about birds: they lay eggs, they have wings, they have feathers. Birds are also are warm-blooded, right? So they can also maintain a stable and warm body temperature during their life cycle. And then their life cycle includes a couple different stages. So first, birds start as eggs. So what I have here for you actually is an ostrich egg. And so you can see, compared to the size of my hand, right, they are very large. So birds all start with eggs as their first life stage. And kind of similar to the mammals, they're cared for, right? So they go through an incubation period after they're laid in the nest, and the embryo will start developing within that egg. And then we move into our different hatchling life stages. So the first, or our chick life stages. So our chick start is what we call a hatchling, and in that hatchling life stage, kind of similar to the kangaroo, they can be really undeveloped. So even though they have the primary characteristics of things like a beak and feet and wings, they may not have things like feathers even yet. They may not even be able to open their eyes. And so during those really early stages, it's super important for them to have parental care. Kind of similar to mammals, they also will have parental care. So the mother will oftentimes stay at the nest for a couple reasons. The first is, if you think about it, if they don't even have feathers yet, or they can't even open their eyes, they're not going to be able to defend themselves. So the mother needs to stick around nearby the nest, and the male will also stick around sometimes from a further distance to watch after the nest and make sure nobody's trying to eat their little chicks. They will also, stay and actually keep the mother will keep the chicks warm before they have those feathers. and also feeding is a big thing. So parental care can be shared between the male and the female. So the male may go out and collect food and bring it back to the female, who will then pick it apart and be able to provide it to those chicks. So after that hatchling stage, which doesn't last too long, but again, depends on which species, they move into the nestling stage. So nestlings are a bit bigger. They start to put on their soft feathers. They start to become a little bit more active. They may be able to open their eyes now, but during this stage, they are still very dependent on the parents. They're still not going to leave the nest. That's why they're called nestlings, because they still have to grow and develop and become stronger. And then we can move into the fledgling stage. So this means now our birds have gotten big enough and they have developed enough that they've put on muscle in their wings. They may now have, or they will have now, their flight feathers, which is going to be important for them to be able to fledge or fly out and leave the nest. So they have their flight feathers now. But during this stage, they're still not independent of their parents, right? So even though they can fledge and leave, they're oftentimes still going to receive help from the parents. And this can be kind of similar to the mammals that we were talking about too. It might be that they are still receiving protection, learning their environment. They may be being shown how to go search for food and collect food within their environment. And then they may still come back to the nest for protection. And then finally, once they've stayed in this fledged stage for long enough, they will grow and develop a full set of feathers, their first plumage, and they can be what we call juveniles or subadults. And so now they can be independent of their parents. They're going to go out on their own. They're going to collect their own food. They're really growing now. They can even be difficult to tell apart from the parents because their feathers are starting to look more similar. And then finally, they can reach their adult stage once they're fully grown and they're old enough to be reproductive on their own. And once they're in their adult stage, they are going to start to invest energy in things such as, now they may want to start building their nests. They have to find a partner or a mate to reproduce with. Then they're going to start raising their own young and going out and searching for that food and defending against predators. And then again, once they get to this stage and they have their own young, then that life cycle has repeated. Okay, cool. So those are the general stages of a bird. And I have one here today to show you, and we can talk about his life cycle a little bit. So what I have for you here is a bird that can be found in Georgia. So this is Red. Red is an eastern screech owl. So working through Red's life cycle a little bit, this is an adult, by the way. So Red looks small, right? I guess that's important to distinguish since we're talking about the life cycle and all those different ages and life stages, right? But Red isn't an adult. It's common for them to be no bigger than the size of about a robin. You can see he's got all of his fully developed feathers. He's got his wing over here on the side that you can see. But working through their life cycle, so Red has about a month-long incubation period of the eggs. So after the eggs are laid, they will be incubating and cared for by the parents for about a month before the chicks hatch out. And so what's kind of cool too is that chicks actually have to kind of put a little bit of effort into hatching out of their eggs. So that's, once they're large enough within their egg, they have to actually, for the most part, peck their way out and get their way out of their egg. And then after they have hatched, the hatchlings and the nestlings there, right, will stay in the nest for about 28 days, roughly a month, before they're willing to fledge out and start going out and searching for food and completing that process. But again, even though they've left after 28 days, they still go through a period of remaining in the care of the adult like red here. So when they actually are in those really young stages, like I was talking about, the male will go out and he will find the food and he will bring the food back to the female who is with the eggs and the young, and she will actually tear it apart and make it able to be eaten by the young. So that's cool. So they do have parental care from both individuals. We got a question about how big the eggs of a screech owl are. So in comparison to an ostrich egg here, right, which almost looks bigger than, oh, red doesn't like that, is almost bigger than red, they're going to be much smaller, right? So I believe they lay anywhere from like 3 to 7 eggs. And so for an owl like this, they're not going to be very big, right? I don't know exactly how big they are, but just think about the relative size of red compared to an ostrich and the size of that egg compared to red. So they're going to be much smaller. And what's cool too, which I was thinking about, is that they'll actually lay them about one at a time through like daily, and then they'll have all of their eggs laid. And what's also cool, speaking of laying the eggs, what's kind of cool about these screech owls too, is that they may not make a nest like a lot of other birds will. So I was talking about how parents will invest energy into making their nests and then laying their eggs. Screech owls will actually just find a cavity in a tree or actually anywhere else that they can find a cavity, and they will lay their eggs in whatever material is already in that cavity. Now they'll create an indent in the material for the eggs to rest in, but they won't actually go out and collect material on their own and make a more structured nest. They'll just use whatever materials are already in that cavity that they find, and they'll use that as their nesting location. And what's even more cool is that once 2 adult screech owls have some eggs and they successfully raise those eggs into young, those screech owls will remain together for life, and they will continue to breed and lay eggs as a pair for the rest of their life. And they'll even use the same nest year after year. So once they really become established and comfortable with each other and their habitat and their location, they will stay there and they'll stay there together, which is really cool about these screech owls. So working through a little bit more of their life cycle, so they become reproductive on their own at about a year. So right, they stay around for about a month to up to like 2 months for that parental care, but then not long after that, after only about a year, they can be reproductive on their own, and then these owls can live to be about 14 years old. So, so that's a really cool example of an owl and the life cycle and how they complete it. Again, they have to meet other strategies, right, to complete their life cycle. So they have a lot of really cool adaptations with their feathers. So we talked about feathers, all birds have them, right? He has really specialized feathers that help him with important strategies in life, such as hunting. So they have these cool soft-tipped feathers that allow them to be silent flyers, so you can't hear them when they're flying, and this makes them really effective at swooping in and catching prey without the prey really even knowing they're coming. They also have some specialized feathers around the face, which I don't know how well you can see, that help move noise towards their ears, so that they can be really good at hearing where their prey is, or maybe even where their predators are, so that they can get away from their predators. But they're really good at hunting, so they are carnivores. So they'll go after food items, and that's just a cool example of a bird. So I don't see any other questions yet. But I hope you all had a good day and you enjoyed this talk and learned a lot. And I look forward to seeing everybody soon. Take care, everybody. We hope to see you again for some more life cycle chats next week, okay? All right.